So in this video, I'm going to explain 2 mindsets that you need to adopt in order to pass IELTS. So my name is Artem. I'm a non-native English speaker and I teach English learners how to become English speakers. And I did a lot of research on this, and I think that these 2 mindsets are going to help you pass IELTS. So the first mindset is podcast mindset. So what it means is it's all about speaking. It's not a test, It's like when you want to pass IELTS, it's not a test, like especially speaking part. It's like you're doing it because you are just talking to a real person. Like imagine you're talking to a real person, right? You're talking to a real person. It's like you don't even need to imagine because you talk to a real person. But maybe in your head you think that, oh, well, what if I say this word incorrectly? What if I make this grammatical mistake? Well, I make this mistake all the time. What if I say this pronunciation mistake? Like they're gonna judge me. And so you think all these different things in your mind. And as it turns out, your mindset is not a podcast mindset. It's not a speaking mindset. It's a test mindset. You're thinking that they're testing you, right? Well, they do test you, but they test you on your speaking mindset. It's like if you don't have the speaking mindset, you're not going to pass it, because like all you have to think about is the other person and your ability to speak. Like not your ability to speak, but your ability to give the information to other person, right? And so what you need is you need the podcast mindset. So I said this word a couple of times, but it's like podcast mindset. What do you mean? So podcast mindset is just a mindset that you need to adopt, and it's all about podcasts. So it's like when you watched a podcast, like have you watched a podcast before? Probably yes, right? You probably watched like a podcast in English or in your native language. And so the people inside the podcast are just like the people inside the IELTS test. It's like when you look at people who pass IELTS test, they're just like talking on the microphone with another person, with the examiner. And so it's like just 2 people sitting with 2 microphones, and other person has like some pages, some like papers, and he asks questions to the other person. It looks like a podcast. Like it just looks the same as podcast, right? It's just a podcast. So, and the thing about this, it's not just like, it doesn't look like a podcast. It's also has the same structure as a podcast, It's like first part of the IELTS test is all about like general questions. They just ask you like 5 simple questions, maybe about your life, maybe just about different stuff, right? And so it's like when you ask those simple questions, like where are you from? It's like they're just like testing you if you can answer those simple questions, right? And if you can answer them, you go to the second part. And the second part is all about your personal opinions. It's like you're just giving a talk about your personal opinions, what you think about this, what you think about this, what you think about that, right? And the third part is all about abstract ideas. So what it means is just like about, let's say, a topic of water bottles, right? Or a topic about microphone. You probably know the topics that IELTS test has, right? So the topics usually include like pollution, like what do you think about pollution? What do you think about crowded areas and stuff like this, right? And so it's just like the podcast. It's the same thing as podcast. So when you go on a podcast, first they're going to ask you simple questions, right? To like start the conversation. So where are you from? They're probably not going to ask you where you're from because like the podcaster did some research on the guest, and so he knows these questions. But he's probably going to start with some light questions first to go deeper after that, right? And so the first part of IELTS is just the same as the first part of the podcast. Second part is about your personal opinions. And so on the podcast, people usually also ask personal opinions. So what do you think about war in that country? If this is a podcast about like political person, right? Then they're going to ask these questions. If, there's a podcast about like, I don't know, psychology, they're going to ask different questions. What do you think about this topic in psychology? And so they're going to give like personal answers to these questions. And the third part is all about abstract questions. It's like when you watch an educational podcast, right? Like a scientific podcast about psychology, they're going to ask a lot of abstract questions to a guest, right? So abstract questions usually like, so what do you think about neuroscience of the brain or something like this? Some boring ass questions. And when people ask them, they give like a talk about neuroscience of the brain, right? And so you need to do the same thing, but at a much simpler level. Like, you don't need to talk about neuroscience of the brain. You just need to talk about some simple stuff. You need to ask general questions. Like, they're not going to ask you some really heavy questions that you don't have the vocabulary to answer. They're going to ask you really simple questions, right? And so just simply adopt this mindset and pretend that it's a podcast, because it is a podcast. It's just the same thing as a podcast. And when you like put yourself in the shoes of a guest, because you are a guest, again, you are a guest of the podcast. When you do that, it's like it becomes a lot easier to answer those questions. And you're like, oh well, I'm a well-known star, so you're just gonna interview me today, like, on my opinions. And so it's kind of easier for you to answer those questions, because you think that, oh well, I'm a guest, I'm a really cool guest at a podcast, and so it's not a problem for me to like answer those questions. I'm a celebrity or something, like, yeah. And so also, if you really want to nail like IELTS, you can watch podcasts as well. You can just copy the way people talk inside the podcast. You can just copy guests and how they respond to questions. And let's say, for example, you don't know the answer to a question, right? You just say that you don't know, right? You say, well, I don't know the answer to this question, but I'll think about this. Or I don't know, I don't know the answer to the question, but I'm thinking that it's blah, 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 right? So it's the same thing as a podcast. It's like if a person on the podcast if a guest on the podcast doesn't know the answer to a question, he or she will just say that, oh, well, I don't know, right? But I will try to elaborate. I will try to answer, right? So do the same thing on the IELTS, right? It's like they testing your English, not your like knowledge, right? Not your general knowledge. They're just testing your English. And if you don't know the answer to a question, they're not even going to lower your score, right? Your score is going to be the same, because like they're testing your English, not your general knowledge. And the second mindset I wanted to give you is practice makes perfect. You're like, what? Practice makes perfect? Like yes, of course. Like, this is so simple. Well, but a lot of people don't get it still, It's like the second reason why the IELTS test is so difficult for a lot of people is just because they're nervous, And, they have a lot of nervousness simply because, like, first, it costs a lot of money, right? It's like, oh, well, I spent so much money on this freaking test. Like, what if I don't pass it? Like, what's going to happen if I don't pass it? They have a lot of doubts, right? Oh, well, I'm going to waste so much money, but like, oh, what will happen? What will my friends think of this? What will my parents think of this, right? I will not go to USA. I will not travel the world, blah, blah, blah. Things like that, right? They also have like difficulty talking to people. It's really difficult to talk to like a stranger for some people, especially in a different language. And so this is also a big problem for a lot of people. And so what you can do to solve this issue is to just practice with real people, right? It's like practice makes perfect, but not just like normal practice. It's like when you practice to ChatGPT answering those questions, it's kind of easy. But when you talk to a real person, that's a whole different story, right? It can be more difficult. It can be, maybe for you, it's not more difficult. Maybe like you just don't care. But usually it's more difficult to talk to real people in English. You may become nervous, especially if you like put money on the stake, right? So simply practice. And what I mean by practice is practice talking to real people. Try to find a person with whom you can talk to, right? Find like a teacher or something. Oh, well, I'm not like advertising myself, but you can do that certainly, right? And so if you watched more than 500 videos on YouTube, right, it's going to be easy for you to understand English, right? You probably did this already, right? You understand me because like you watched a lot of videos on YouTube. It's not a problem for you to understand English. And when you watch more videos on YouTube, it's like, oh, well, it's so easy. Like, I just want to watch another video and another one, right? And so the same thing is going to happen when you answer 500 questions. When you watched 500 videos on YouTube, it's really easy for you to watch more, right? And when you answer 500 questions, it's going to be easier to answer more, right? You will think that, oh, well, here we go again. I'm answering the same freaking question and it's just so boring. Like, yes, so go ahead, like blah, 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 blah. And it's really easy for you to talk about literally everything simply because you've been doing it for a long periods of time, right? And so it's really easy for me to talk on the camera about these different topics about English simply because I did it more than 200 times, I believe. I recorded more than 200 videos. I uploaded like 50 videos or so, but I've recorded more than 200 videos. And it's really easy for me to talk simply because I did it a lot of times, right? And so, yeah, just simply have the podcast mindset, right? Watch podcasts and then combine it with practice makes perfect, right? So we can watch a lot of podcasts and combine it with practice makes perfect, and that will allow you to like pass IELTS and get like band 7, band 8, band 9 easier, right? Because you will think that, oh, well, I'm actually on a podcast right now and I did it 500 times. I did 500 podcasts. So it's really easy for me to like go on this podcast as well, right? So when you have this mindset, as you can see, it becomes a lot easier for you to just simply pass IELTS with a great score, right? Of course, practice, 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 right? practice, and you're going to become fluent on the IELTS test and in general, right? And when people ask you questions, you will just like nail all of them, even if it's not IELTS, right? Because like the thing about IELTS, you're doing it just to like talk to people in real life, right? So what's the point of passing IELTS if you're not talking to people in real life right now, right? So just simply find somebody you can talk to, not for the emotional support, but for the like practicing purposes, of course. And yeah, so if you want to take it like a step further, I have my own community where I teach people about how to improve their English. We also do speaking calls, 3 speaking calls per week. And so you can join them and practice your English as well, because I ask a lot of questions usually about self-improvement topics, but sometimes they're general topics. And so they relate a lot to the IELTS test sometimes. And so I think that will definitely benefit you with your practice for IELTS. And by the way, I also do my coaching as well. So if you're interested in something like this, you can also join our community and I'll explain how it works. Also, I do one-to-one free speaking call, like a one-to-one free coaching call where you can hop on a call with me and I'll give you feedback on your IELTS as well and just on your general English, right? So IELTS is just like English. Like there's not much difference, right? And so, yeah. What I wanted to say in the end, subscribe, tell in the comments what you can improve. What do you think is lacking in you right now? I'll answer all of the questions. And so yeah, see you in the next video. Bye-bye.